Now, today on the show, it's all about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, as I mentioned earlier, which became fully operational just yesterday. Yes, January 1, we took off as a continent to integrate on trade, economies, and everything. We are going to share resources together. We are going to share ideas together. We are going to have the best experts to bring on board the expertise for us to move as a continent and share and be able to progress economically, to move the African continent ahead. So the person who will be helping me do this interesting discussion is Ziad Hamoui, and he's the national president of Borderless Alliance, and I'm so excited to have him in the studio. Now, Ziad, you're welcome to Diplomatic Affairs.
Thank you for the invitation.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm very happy actually with the launching yesterday. So everyone is basically excited about the commencement of trade on the AFCFTA. It's been a long time coming. Yes. Strength is in unity, and Africa must speak in one voice, and AFCFTA will help us achieve that. So we're all excited.
AFC, African Continental Free Trade Agreement. AFCTA.
CF. So the a capital A with a small f for Africa.
Okay.
And then continental, right. C.
Okay.
And then F for free, and T for trade, and A agreement, AFCFTA. Okay. And yes, it's a mouthful, but at the time it was very extensively discussed before they arrived at a name that is first of all unique, and second that is representative of the discussions and the objective where they want to take it. They wanted a free trade agreement, they wanted a continental, and they wanted it to be African, and so they wanted to spell it out inside. So we have an agreement and we have an area. So when you say AFCFTA, most of the time you're referring to the agreement itself.
Yes, because that is what is common in the public domain.
Yes.
So the AFC, is it the African Continental Free Trade Area?
Yes.
Right.
So most of the time we try using AFTA.
Okay, yes.
Although if you have to be very specific, you have to say AFTA. So you sound a bit awkward. It is, but we will get used to it, and then AFTA would still eventually, it will still speak about the same thing. Eventually, we are looking at action, not just words, not just another talk shop.
Right.
And so we'll get around to getting used to the pronunciation, and that actually brings into perspective the role of mass media in educating the masses about what the agreement is, what the area is going to be, what's in it for the trader.
That's part of it. It is why we have this platform, Diplomatic Affairs. This is what we do. At the end of the day, we would like to sensitize the general public on the various issues that are coming up. And that makes me happy to know that there is a platform that is dedicated to Pan-Africanism. And this is our own story we are telling. And it's good to have a platform like this one, broadcasting every now and then what the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is all about. Before we delve into the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, let's talk about Borderless Alliance. I'm sure people will be wondering, what is it at all that they do? Who are they? And what are your objectives?
So in 2010, when we were discussing the problem with private sector participation in policy making with regard to free trade and the movement of people, regional trade and regional movement of people, it was apparent that there was a lack of private sector participation in policy making when it comes to regional trade and transportation. So you had the regional economic communities, you had ECOWAS and you had UEMOA, and you had the national government agencies and the authorities which are in charge of trade and transportation, but somehow the regional integration agenda was not progressing. And at the same time, the voice of the private sector was considered to be too scattered and fragmented, not speaking with one language, with different...
In one voice.
And not speaking one voice. And this actually highlights the fact that when people talk about private sector, what they fail to understand is that there is no one private sector. There are groups under the private sector that have different interests, that have different priorities, that have different agendas, and they don't speak in one voice and they don't pull in the same direction. So Borderless Alliance in 2010, we sat down as a group of stakeholders from the trade and transportation within West Africa, and we decided that we needed to have a regional body that owns the regional integration agenda, that engages with the policymakers and accelerates regional integration by tackling the barriers to trade and transport. And to do that, we relied on some earlier studies that were done between UEMWA and USAID through a regional program called Trade Hub. And the Trade Hub came with a gap analysis about the implementation of the ECOWAS Trade Liberalization Scheme, ETLS, at the time. And they found out that there were so many gaps between the regional texts and the implementation on the ground. And they came up with an agenda, which was the Borderless Agenda, in order to accelerate regional integration. But then what we did was to rally the private sector participation to found a regional body, and then to own this agenda in partnership and collaboration with the representatives of the organized private associations, the traders, the manufacturers in the region. So what the Borderless Alliance does is to promote regional economic integration and the free movement of goods and people across West Africa. And we do that with advocacy. So we have built one of the premier platforms for dialogue and information dissemination with policymakers in West Africa. It is headed in Ghana and operating currently in 9 different countries in West Africa, including Ghana. And I am one of the founding members of the Borderless Alliance, also the president of the executive committee across West Africa between 2012 and 2016. So in 2016, when I stepped down, I focused on my activities in Ghana. I was elected later in 2016 as the national president, and so started representing the group on the country level, and so widening our engagement with the various representatives from government agencies, but also including other sectors of the private sector, women traders, youth, lots of small and medium entrepreneurs, multinationals, and then bringing all of this together to agree on a common agenda, and then driving this agenda forward is a bit of a tricky affair.
It is.
And we've been working on that one since 2012.
Since 2012. Great. What a profile you have there.
Thank you.
Well, so when we talk about free trade, what is it about?
Well, first of all, free trade is not free.
Free trade is not free. That's very interesting.
Yes, because when you talk about free trade, people think that free trade means that you just move around without any laws, without any regulations, without any payments, without any fees or charges. Free trade is actually the movement itself, the freedom of the movement, unhindered by obstacles. But the assumption is always that you have to comply with the rules and the regulations in the countries in which you are operating. And in exchange for this compliance, you expect some facilitation. So if I wanted to boil down what the Borderless Alliance does in 2 words, I would say we work a lot on trade facilitation. And trade facilitation is the reduction of the obstacles of the movement of trade across the region. And when we talk about trade facilitation, what automatically comes into mind is the red tape and the non-tariff barriers, whether there are at the points of entries, at the airports and the seaports, or whether along the roads, corridors, checkpoints and others, or at the border crossings, lack of mutual recognition, for example, of text. We have been working on these areas for a few years now, and they're difficult. They're very difficult because of the nature of the alliances in various countries that cross and that help to create this kind of resistance against reform on various levels, whether from members of private sector with members of public sector conniving together to create these kinds of special islands of vested interests, which are supposed to, which creates a case of unfair competition across the region. So, as Borderless Alliance, we tackle these barriers to trade. We look, first of all, at the evidence base. So we look at sources of information. We look at facts on the ground. and then we bring these to we highlight the problems, we suggest solutions, and then we monitor and follow up on the implementations of these solutions.
Right. This excites me a lot. You suggest solutions. When you do, are they taken?
Those
are recommendations. Are they taken?
Many of the recommendations are taken into consideration when there is political will. And so if your question was about an assessment of the success of policy interventions or advocacy in general across West Africa, I'll tell you that we had a mixed bag of reactions and responses. So in some countries, you might go through the same process and you reach the decision makers and suggest what plan of action needs to be taken, and it's taken when you have a reactive kind of government or policy making. And there are some cases where you reach a certain dead end or a black void where suggestions are shelved somewhere and then they are never acted upon. Now, one of the reasons, for example, a body like ECOWAS, a regional economic community that was inaugurated in 1975 with an economic trade liberalization scheme that dates since 1979 and then was re-enhanced in 1990. So a long history over there. You would think that we might have gone further than we did for a body that is 45 years old. But unfortunately, the facts on the ground show us that we're still a long way to go for regional integration, at least as West Africa itself. Now, in full disclosure, we also had a lot of problems beyond trade. We had security issues, we had insurgencies, we had instability in certain areas. There were some economic ups and downs because
disruptions
of
here and there.
There, and then there's the way the economies are initially designed. And that is some kind of a colonial heritage that West Africa had to go through. Now, admittedly, ECOWAS came after we have dismantled the colonial history in West Africa, but then the vestige went through with us. If you look at the way West African countries are designed, it seems as if most of the corridors are conduits of the primary resources out of the country so that they will be reproduced outside, manufactured outside, and then they are brought back in the form of finished goods, which are to be consumed within West Africa. And this creates a kind of imbalance that makes it more difficult to integrate also.
Would you say we need a continental policy to drive this agenda?
I would say that one of the major lessons from the progress of the ECOWAS regional integration agenda is the need to have a dispute resolution mechanism that takes into consideration, that monitors the implementation of regional regulations on national level.
That is something that they need to begin looking at, or we have something already instituted?
We have actually drawn on the lessons of ECOWAS and other RECs across Africa, or rather the challenges that some of these regional economic communities went through, and they were embedded into the various protocols of the AFCFTA. Now, keep in mind that when we talk about the AFCFTA, it's not just an agreement that everyone signs into. It's a multi-layered it's a multi-layered agreement where the first layer, which is the simplest, is the framework agreement. Then it is broken down on the second layer into protocols. For example, trade in goods protocols, trade in services. Now, one of the interesting protocols is the rules and procedures on dispute settlement. And this one is particularly to resolve issues and disputes that arise from the lack of implementation of the trade agreements within the AFCFTA. And this is a huge initiative. So in this case, in other words, if a country X is having problems in exporting or importing from country Y because of a lack of the implementation of the regulations that were signed on to by both countries, you have a body that is set up to look into these issues and to issue verdicts.
So this cannot work without us coming to an agreement.
In the sense
it
that
is one of the challenges. I know I will be coming to the challenges that have been outlined. I know you have been on the ground for quite some time now. Therefore, you have really carried out a few research and you are willing to share some of the challenges that you came out with. Is that right?
So we were
This is gonna be
working
one
on
of them.
ETLS and
Okay.
its implementation across West Africa. And as we were saying, ETLS is the ECOWAS Trade Liberalization Scheme, which is the trade, the preferential agreement between the West African members of ECOWAS that says that if you have a product that is registered duly in one of the countries within West Africa, and that it fulfills the requirements of the rules of origin, then you are entitled to move this product across the region duty-free.
Okay.
But then the implementation of this ETLS was lackluster because of the fact that there was nobody to resort to with your complaints in case of violation of the rules at state level. And we can,
It makes it ineffective.
it makes it not just ineffective, it just short circuits the procedure itself. In fact, many RECs, including ECOWAS, had some kind of a gentleman's agreement where countries agreed to abide by the regional regulations, but not in a way that goes beyond this kind of alternative dispute resolution mechanism, which does not clearly lays responsibility where it needs to be laid and draws penalties or forces or is able of enforcing whatever kind of ruling in favor of one of these parties. So two parties have who had issues with the implementation of ETLS had nowhere to resort to. Now, admittedly, ECOWAS had seen this issue, and there was an initiative which they rolled out over the past 4 years. There was a high-level task force, which was called the ETLS Task Force, which was chaired by a former president of Niger, His Excellency Lieutenant General Salou Djibo, and a number of eminent West African figures who went across the 15 countries in West Africa in order to charter and to monitor the implementation of ETLS in the various countries. And so they came up with these reports, country reports that were signed with memorandum of understanding between the ETLS task force representing ECOWAS and the country in person. And then these reports came up with suggestions. And many of these country reports were followed up by with a monitoring mission to look at the implementation of these. And so some of the actions and the suggestions that came out of that particular board were acted upon. And it was very interesting that many of the issues that we still complain about now have been successfully highlighted and pointed out.
Okay.
Some of them have been acted upon.
Some of them have been acted upon.
Some of them have been acted upon.
That's great.
Yes. So there were some successes, but of course you have to take it into consideration. You can keep in mind the fact that absent a clear mechanism for dispute resolution and a clear mandate from the heads of state of ECOWAS, there is only so much that you can solve when there are some issues that have the need to political will. So when you're talking about the relationship between countries, certain mechanisms within West Africa would have to manifest themselves. So let's take, for example, the economic parameter within West Africa. If we look today at the top 10 economies by GDP across Africa, you see that the leading country is Nigeria with $448 billion GDP. That 448 GDP is a significant portion of the, let's say, around $650 billion GDP, combined GDP of West Africa. So of the entire ECOWAS 15 countries, amounting to $650 billion. 450 billion of that is Nigerian economy itself.
All right, so we have that on the screen. So, yeah.
So that this gives a particular economic muscle to Nigeria.
So these are the top African economies by GDP.
Yeah.
All right.
So from these countries, Nigeria ranks first on the continental level.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing And this will also put AFCFTA into perspective. So Nigeria forms about 70%, 65 to 70% of the total GDP of West Africa. And the head office of ECOWAS is actually in Nigeria. So this gives them some kind of
leverage.
A lot of leverage, both economically and politically, and they become intertwined. Politics and economics, they come hand in hand. So Nigeria turns out eventually to become the most difficult player, economic player, and most key figure within West Africa. And this is why the strength and unity of the AFCFTA is very important. When you combine the might of the 55 African countries, you come up with a GDP of around $2.5 trillion. Of that $2.5 trillion, Nigeria now constitutes, let's say, about 20 or 25% of the total African volume. So you no longer have the same leverage that you can have within your regional economic community. And now you have a sanction mechanism. Let me not call it sanction mechanism. Let's call it a dispute resolution mechanism that will assist in issuing verdicts.
A dispute resolution mechanism.
Yes.
All right.
Which is embedded into the African Continental Free Trade Area. So we will have something similar to what the World Trade Organization has, and it's called an appellation body.
All right.
But it will be at an advantage of the appellation body of the World Trade Organization. You might be aware of the current standstill within the World Trade Organization, not because of the finalist race between the Nigerian and the South Korean candidates, but because of the American veto on the appointment of members to the appellation body of the World Trade Organization, which basically grounds that process to a halt. So even at WTO level, there's a problem with politics.
Right. And
we have actually learned from the challenges of the World Trade Organization by embedding a clause within the dispute resolution mechanism of the AFCFTA, so that we can avoid the creation of a void because of the inability to agree or to select or to nominate. Then the body has a mechanism that would allow it to fill that void in a due process, so that the appellation body of the AFCFTA would still be in motion, and it would still be able to effectively hand out verdicts and redress, which is a good thing.
When you say we have learned from some of these challenges with the World Trade Organization, you mean the African Continental Free Trade Agreement?
I mean the African Union.
Or the African AU?
Yes.
All right,
which let's call them, which is the father of the African
the umbrella body.
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
That is in charge of the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area.
Now, Ziad, you haven't quite elaborated the many challenges when we talk about the free trade agreement. Yeah. Can we just flip through what are the other obstacles that may be impeding the progress of this initiative?
So let me try to gather my thoughts. The 1st of January, first of all, is a celebratory event. It's a cause of joy. For the first time, we have reached the milestone of the actual start of trade under AFCFTA, despite the challenges caused by COVID-19. Yes, we are not yet 100% ready, but this is not the first time that a regional body that is starting trade without having everything that is fully
needed to take off.
Yes, but we need to move, and we have done.
The most important thing is to make a move.
Yes. The most important thing is to do it, and then to address the teething challenges as we are moving on. And this is something that will allow also give us the opportunity to rope in the other members who are yet to ratify. As we stand, for example, out of the 55 countries in Africa, 44 signed in Kigali in March of 2018, and that number went up to 54 by the time it entered into force on May 2019. As it stands today, we have 34 ratifications that were successfully deposited by the African countries at the African Union, with 3 which are pending the confirmation from the Parliament Authority, which means that the number will become 37 very soon. So they have gone through their due process, but they haven't actually deposited, ratified. So it's 34 plus 3 making 37. And so we are left with a few other countries which are yet to
Join.
ratify in order to join and make them officially members so that they can effectively trade under the terms of the AFCFTA. Because if you have not deposited your instrument of ratification, you are not eligible to trade under the terms of the AFCFTA in the first place. So that is the first comment I can make.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the AFCFTA protocols have not been duly completed and submitted, as the COVID-19 challenge has forced us to shift some of the discussions in particular areas and move forward. And I'll elaborate. So as we stand, the schedule of tariff concessions, for example, stands, which is the actual document that says which tariff lines fall under the 90% that particular countries are going to fully liberalize within a particular number of years, and what is the 7% that they will take longer to liberalize, and that would be the sensitive goods, and then the 3% that they are going to keep their tariffs on. So in other words, keep in mind that not 100% of trade in a particular country will be liberalized. Countries will have 3% of their tariff lines, which they would deem as strategic lines, and they will still keep their tariffs on it. Now, as it stands, 41 countries have successfully submitted their schedule of tariff concessions. 41. Which means we are, it's a significant number, but we are still short from 55. Short of 54 even. So we need more countries to ratify, and we need more countries to complete the schedules of tariff concessions. Before I move away from the schedule of tariff concession, it's important to note something, that these schedules of tariff concessions are considered to be public documents. And in some countries, it is unclear whether the relevant authorities have made their proposals, their draft proposals, publicly available and easily accessible or not. So I would like to urge representative organized private associations in Ghana and elsewhere to request this kind of information from their countries, maybe the ministries of trade or the designated focal point in that area, so that they will know what are the 90% products that enter under tariff liberalization, and then the 7% and the 3%. It's important because business organizations need to prepare their production, their manufacturing, their logistics, their assembly lines, and so you need to know early enough what are the requirements in order to to unlock the potential of trade under the AFCFTA. So that is one thing. Another very important point is the rule of is the rules of origin.
Okay.
And the rules of origin is basically what determines what are the conditions for your product to be considered as originating in Africa. And today we were informed that it was agreed that 60% will be the basis for value addition that will make it eligible for a product to be originating in Africa. And we are told that we are at 81% or 82% completion on the rules of origin, which means that the countries are yet to fully submit and to work on their rules of origin. Now, another also important point, this time coming from the Protocol on Trade in Services. And you know that in the Protocol of Trade in Services, the heads of state have determined 5 priority areas for liberalization, and that would be business services, transportation, information communication, tourism, and then finance, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. So as it stands, 31 countries have submitted their schedules of specific commitments.
All right.
So there is some progress that have been made over the past few weeks, and
I
the
think
negotiations
very
significant progress.
Good progress.
Yes, and one of the downsides of this frantic effort to meet the deadline of the 1st of January, in fact, it was the deadline of the 5th of December, where the official meeting was set up for the heads of state to announce that they are ready for the 1st of January. One of the downsides was that there wasn't adequate consultation with the representatives of the business community, whether they organize private associations or whether the business services or civil society organizations.
Why is that?
I think it is the
lack of time?
It is the lack of time. And basically, maybe a combination of a lack of time and a lack of capacity, a combination of both. Keep in mind, not all countries, for example, have the required structures that can shuttle back and forth between negotiations and between discussions. Getting to the end of the year is a very busy time for many countries. This year was the last 3 or 4 months have been very busy with elections, Ghana being one of them. But Niger just had its election last week, Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, other countries across Africa. So a lot of disruptions from outside of the system. And you need the ability to continue with the planning without the noise coming from the rest of the so all of this has been taking place, and all of this is in the back of my mind as we enter into the commencement of trade under the AFCFTA.
Now, talking of the commencement of trade under the
AFCFTA.
AFCFTA. I've never gotten it right.
Okay. The easiest way to do that is to know that it's an FTA. It's a free trade agreement, right?
All right.
So, and it's an African one, and it's a continental one. So it's an African continental. So it's an AFCFTA.
AFCFTA.
Yes.
I got it right this time around. All right then.